asking why are we trying to solve this problem, what value are we going to add to the business, is always a great place to start, rather than just like jumping in with the methodology that you know.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heavy-Chan Jung from towardsdatascience.com. And today I have the privilege of introducing Ms. Maura Church, who is the head of data science at Patreon. She will be joining us from San Francisco, and I'm very excited to have her today. So thanks for joining, Maura.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's get started with question one. So can you tell us about your professional background?
Yeah, so before Patreon, I was at Google working on data there in a data analysis team. I was working on spam and abuse specifically. So on data applied to trying to help reduce the amount of spam, abuse, and fraud in Google's communications products. And before that, I was studying applied math and music. So my background and my degree is in applied mathematics, specifically in how to mathematics to understand music better. So kind of this intersection of technology and arts and computer science is where I have my interests. So yeah, worked at Google for a bit and then joined Patreon about 4 years ago as the second data scientist, and have been with the company since then.
Cool. So what was it like joining as a second data scientist? What was your day-to-day responsibilities when you first started? And how has it evolved throughout the years?
So when I first started, I like to joke that, I mean, it's not a joke because it's true, but at the time, Patreon was our main data infrastructure was writing all of our key metrics to a Google Sheet that refreshed every day via the Google Sheets API and a cron job, which was effective at the time and like the perfect solution for what we needed. But that was the environment I was coming into, was we didn't really have any data infrastructure set up. We were beginning to learn kind of the foundational data questions that we wanted to ask about how creators grow and how patrons grow, and how the business grows. And so a lot of that first year was spent really doing like data engineering work. So setting up our first ETLs. We did a big migration from MySQL to Redshift, which is pretty big on the data side, defining our core metrics and what we wanted to measure and building the first kind of key dashboards. That was a lot of the first year of the company, is like answering those foundational questions and getting started. And now my day-to-day looks very different. So I manage 5 data scientists. I have a lot more influence on kind of strategy and like where should our data help us and where can it tell us where to go, and a lot more focus on product analytics, which is like, how is the product performing? How do we run experiments well, than in the early days when we were kind of just getting started.
All right, so you mentioned that today you guys are working on more product-related questions. So are most of the data scientists there working on those types of questions, or are there more different segments? So can you tell us about the structures of different data teams at Patreon?
So we were one core data science team. So we're all like a centralized, there's kind of a centralized versus embedded model. And we're very much a centralized team. And we support, I would say, 4 major functions at the business. So the first is product analytics, which is pretty straightforward, like measuring the performance of the product. The second is business analytics. So that's all the data and metrics related to our go-to-market and business teams. So sales, marketing, what we call creator success, finance, legal, those kind of functions. Then we have some of our work dedicated to what I would call like core research. So these are the more foundational, deep questions about creators and patrons that are going to drive kind of across the entire business. And then the fourth pillar would be like business intelligence, data education, and data accessibility. So this is things like making improvements to our data onboarding for new employees, or maybe making a resource that makes data more accessible and interpretable to the company. And probably 70% of what we do on a quarterly basis is in that product analytics bucket. But then some folks have their roles a little bit more geared towards the business analytics side. Some folks spend more time on the like data education. So it kind of depends on the person and the quarter and what we're trying to do that month.
Mm-hmm. You say that your main duty as the head of data science at Patreon is to make sure that, quote, creators, patrons, and teammates at Patreon have the data they need to make excellent decisions. Can you elaborate on what this means? How can patrons or creators leverage internal company data to make more informed external decisions?
So the hope is for the data science team that I kind of think about the spectrum of like foundational data infrastructure to data products that are powering the creative economy. And today we're probably like 60–70% of the way towards that journey. So my hope is in the future that we are building products, data products or APIs or models that are embedded within patreon.com and are enabling creators and patrons to make better decisions. So for example, maybe we help creators understand the churn characteristics of their patrons and their membership, that then help those creators take better actions to retain those members and to grow their membership on Patreon. Or maybe we're telling patrons about the most popular post or benefit that they haven't yet seen, and that's powered by something that the data science team has built. Right now, we only have one of those models in production, so it's a fraud model, which is mostly helping Patreon, not charge fraudulent pledges rather than helping creators and patrons. But my hope is that in the long term, we're building data products that are really powering the site.
Oh, great. So what are the traits, qualities, or backgrounds that you seek in prospective data scientists at Patreon?
There are a few things that are really important to me, especially because Patreon's a startup, and I think being a data scientist at a startup can be very different than being a data scientist at a much more established company where maybe they have like 100 data scientists. So a few things that are key. One is like a technical bar. So we're working every day in SQL, specifically in Postgres and in Python. And definitely I look for candidates who are going to come in with some sort of fluency in some sort of statistical language. So again, we prefer Python, but R is also great. And then who are really comfortable querying large data sets, whether that's through MySQL or Postgres or like another SQL-like language. Technical bar is super important. The second is communication. So we're in roles where a lot of our day-to-day is spent getting these great insights or building these models and then needing to communicate the results of that to stakeholders, whether that's product managers or marketing folks or people in finance. So it's super key to me that data science candidates have good communication and are able to communicate well. The third would be like grit and tenacity and willingness to solve hard problems. Patreon is a pretty new product in a pretty new market. And so the things that we're trying to learn and the problems we're trying to solve are generally hard problems. And so my hope is that anyone who joins the data science team is like excited about hard problems and bumping up against big challenges. And fourth, it's great if candidates have a passion for the arts and a passion for our mission and like care about what we want to do. Although that's not the most important. The first three are kind of the main three I look for.
So the first thing is that there needs to be some kind of a technical baseline, as you mentioned, whether it's SQL, Postgres, Python, R. The second part is the ability to have really good communication, right? And the third part is sort of this willingness to learn something new, so something kind of about their character. The fourth represents their passion. So if those are the four things that are important that you seek in prospective data scientists, what are the things that you don't seek? In other words, what are some common pitfalls that you have seen for those who are in the hiring process?
One common pitfall I see pretty frequently is there's this idea of like Maslow's hammer, which is this phrase that like for someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, which is kind of this desire to apply a methodology that a candidate might feel really comfortable with to any problem, regardless of the actual problem. So maybe a candidate is like getting into TensorFlow and like learning Keras and getting into deep learning. And so any problem that they come to, they're going to be like, oh, let me try TensorFlow. Let me see if I apply deep learning to this. Or maybe they've just learned a lot about logistic regression. So everything kind of looks like a logistic regression. And I think that is a super important pitfall to avoid, because some problems that you're going to be faced with, maybe they just need a simple Excel spreadsheet, or maybe actually the way to solve them is by getting folks in a room and like talking about it. So I think making sure that that you're really thinking about the right methodology to approach a problem with is a pretty important pitfall to avoid.
So that would be kind of like zooming out from the questions that you're trying to solve and asking why you're applying certain models or certain techniques. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Asking why are we trying to solve this problem? What value are we going to add to the business is always a great place to start, rather than just like jumping in with the methodology that you know.
So for those who are, let's say, entering the data science field, who are not so familiar with this kind of thing, what are some of the ways you can recommend that they improve on this particular aspect of the application process?
So there are some definitely great books on strategic thinking. If you Google like Harvard Business Review's books on strategic thinking, I think that will help. I think it's really great for data scientists to have the skill of thinking strategically, of like asking longer term questions and kind of framing things towards why they're being done. So that's definitely one, is like you can just read about this. There are, I'm sure, hundreds of Medium blog posts as well. The second, I think it can be really valuable for candidates to think of like case studies of similar products. So for example, like you could come up in your mind with, 10 feature ideas for like Pinterest or Airbnb or Lyft, or like these really common software products, and think up a bunch of feature ideas and then kind of go through the practice of, before you think about how you would analyze that feature, stepping back and asking like, why would you build that feature to begin with, can help just get at kind of the muscle of asking why, and starting with that instead of diving right in.
Great. So focusing more specifically on Patreon, can you tell us what are some of the major data challenges that the company faces?
So there are so many. It's it's an exciting thing to have. So one of the biggest data challenges we face is creators do membership in many different ways. So for example, you might have a musician where when they launch their Patreon page, they're really launching it for the support of their fans. And they just kind of want to bring their fans along for the ride of any of the music that they make. Whereas you might have a different creator, let's say a podcaster, who's really starting a membership to offer exclusive content. And the fact that there are so many different business models for why people use Patreon and how they use it and how they structure their pricing and their benefits, that makes it really challenging from the data side, because we have some of those kind of like foundational clustering of like, what do these different business models look like? But they're not canonical. Someone doesn't sign up to patreon.com and say, I want to run a support-oriented membership, or I want to run a content-oriented membership. So that unstructured business model problem in the data is really challenging for us, because it means we have to rely on other elements and characteristics that we see in like the payment behavior and the pricing behavior to try to figure out what's going to work for a given creator. So that's one of our biggest data challenges. I would say the second is Patreon's been around for about 6 years, and we have throughout that time had different messages and kind of marketing and branding to go with our strategy at the time. And right now we're really focused on membership. Patreon's a place where you can build a membership, get paid by your biggest fans. But that's a very different model than a lot of our earliest creators. So in some ways, our historical data might not actually be the most valuable thing for us to look at if we're trying to kind of make this new market of membership. So that's just kind of an inherent challenge of like, what data do you use for which problem, and how much are we relying on older data versus data from creators who maybe have launched in the past year?
No, the second problem actually sounds very interesting, because you seem to have this cold start problem, right? So you don't really have the data that you need to really predict on what the future behavior might be. So in those kinds of challenges, what are some of the strategies that you've applied that you think have been successful?
So that's such a good question. What has been successful for us? I think one approach we've taken, which is actually not really a data approach, but just like a business approach, is to really try to pick canonical and case study examples of what we're looking for. So finding a creator who's doing membership really well and diving deep into understanding, what are they doing? How are they setting up their page? How are they delivering value to their members? And using that as an example and kind of a model to try to find other creators. So to give a more explicit example, we know that podcast creators on Patreon have really good retention because they're releasing serialized content every week. And so if you know there's a brand new episode next week, you're likely to stick around. And so we've kind of taken that as an example to say, okay, how could we encourage other creators to make serialized content? And how can we kind of take this insight from a very specific kind of creator and apply it more broadly and make it relevant to all of our creators? So yeah, I think that like case study or like canonical creator approach has been helpful for us in the lack of kind of data.
So you've laid out these, some challenges ahead that the company faces. Well, conversely, can you tell us what are major accomplishments in Patreon that's led by the data science team that you guys have achieved? Can you give us some specific examples on certain experiments or models that have helped Patreon grow and develop?
One of our key achievements that I'm really excited about is the work that we have done to fight fraud. So fraud and machine learning for fraud has been a major focus of the data team for the past year. And any company that processes payments is going to have to fight fraud. It's obviously just super important to keep the risk low. And that's something that I think where we've been really successful and been able to deploy models to production that are catching fraud before it happens and before that kind of becomes a loss to the company. So that's one very clear example in the past year. I think the other example I'm really proud of is, we're processing millions and millions of dollars of payments to creators. This year, we're going to cross $1 billion paid out to creators, which I'm super excited about. And we've built up really robust analytics around those payments so that we can say, for any given month, for specific creators, for specific processors at specific times, exactly what's happening. And that was years of work on the infrastructure side and dashboarding and analytics and even common metrics and definitions that I've been really excited about, because now, if we ask a question about our payments data, we can almost always answer it, which is a pretty huge accomplishment in my mind. The third one I'll mention is just that Patreon is a very open and transparent data culture. So like anyone at the company has access to the most important metrics and kind of the access to the education to understand them. And that has been a lot of work in the team building up Tableau dashboards and mode dashboards and investing in data education and in courses for people and in one-on-one teaching. And I feel really proud that we kind of have a company with that level of transparency around our metrics and our growth and kind of our key data points across the company.
Just a question in general. You are a data leader in your company, as well as the data science community as a whole. So what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you've experienced occupying such a position?
Challenges and opportunities. Well, every challenge I try to frame as an opportunity because then I get excited to solve it. There are a lot of challenges. I think some of the ones that I've really seen in the past year, especially in like data science as a whole, but of course at Patreon as well, is responsible use of data. Obviously this is like a big hot topic right now with GDPR and everything that's going around with data privacy, but I think it's super important to collect only the data that you need to build a great business and to be like really communicative and responsible about that to your users. And I think that also has to be reflected in an internal data culture. So, if someone says, hey, we'd love to collect this information about creators and patrons, I really see it as the role of the data leader to ask, like, why do we need that information? What are we going to do with it? And how are we weighing the cost and benefits of collecting that information and the ethics behind collecting it versus like the actual business use? So that's a broader trend. I think at Patreon, we've been really lucky to, I think we have really responsible use of data. So that's one. The second challenge I would say is data to inform decision-making. So different companies have different amounts of data that they want to use in their decision-making. There's this whole question of like, are you data-driven versus data-informed? And at Patreon, I think one of the greatest opportunities I have and our data science team has is to help leaders have data-informed decisions. You don't want to rely too much on the data. You don't just want to look at an experiment results and like ship something without knowing about how users feel about it. But you also don't want to be completely ignoring your data, right? That would also be bad. So that fine balance of having enough data, but not relying on it too heavily is one of the greatest challenges and opportunities that I have on a daily basis.
On a more personal level, what are some lessons that you've learned in growing the data science team at Patreon?
One of the most important lessons I think I've learned is that it's really valuable to start with heuristics and just start with a few assumptions and to go from there, then to like dive into really complex modeling or dive into writing the query. I've seen so many times, we've maybe invested in slightly a heavier handed data science approach where we could have started with a few like basic heuristics and assumptions in an Excel model. And I think that's just like a tendency of data scientists when you have the skills and you know how to solve complex problems, you can kind of start there instead of starting with heuristics. And that's burned me a few times where I've like, in the early days, I really started with machine learning and I really should have just started with like a list of bullet points and a few heuristics. So that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned. Another one is that, a lot of companies don't even have their data in a state where it's usable to produce insights. And I think investing in having clean, accurate, high quality data is really worth the time to invest in it. We, in the first few years of data science at Patreon, made some heavy investments in the quality of our behavioral analytics. So like users clicking on things and users going through funnels. They were in a state where they, were not very standardized, and kind of the naming schema was all over the place. And we took the time to really step back and make serious investments there. And that's been super beneficial because now we actually trust that the insights we have are accurate. So I think, yeah, the lesson of just taking the time to invest in quality can really pay off in the long run.
As a final question, do you have any words of wisdom for towards data science community for those who are already in data science, so they're already working as data scientists, or they want to become data scientists and want to work specifically in a company that, let's say, deals with creator space? Do you have any recommendations for people like them?
Always be learning. That's my recommendation. I think that if you have a curiosity about a space or about a topic, to just like be insatiable about learning more. So for example, we're in the creative space here at Patreon, and I try to frequently watch YouTube videos and go to shows and really understand the user problem that we are trying to solve. And I think that empathy for the problem that the users are experiencing can go such a long way in building a better product. So yeah, I definitely recommend to data scientists that they follow their curiosity, and if they're excited about a certain field or a certain data set, to try to become immersed in it. The other piece of advice I have is, the job of a data scientist at the end of the day is really getting to know the data of the company that they're working at. And so if that data set is not innately interesting to you, that's a red flag. So for example, at Patreon, our data set is payments between patrons and creators for all the content, across the globe. And that to me is like a really fascinating data set. It's like, wow, all these people are paying people for creative content. That's so cool. And so just think about the data that you'll actually be dealing with on a daily basis. And if that's not innately exciting to you, then ask questions or go somewhere where the data is exciting to you.
That sounds great. And I think that's all the time that we have for today. So thank you for joining again, Mara.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.